I was brought up in my hometown, a small town in south of England. There were 3 cinemas, and I went to them every one of them every week practically. So I just fell in love with the cinema. And of course, the 50s was a great era. I mean, you know, my great heroes were like Billy Wilder and then later Renoir, a lot of French. Well, although those films really didn't get down to small provincial town, but so the main body of the work that you saw was American in those days. Then when I moved to London, you know, I fell in love with sort of Jean-Luc Godard and Truffaut and Renoir, and then your education in terms of the cinema started. And who could not want to make films? I mean, who could not want to? And it's such a wonderful art form if you can get it right. It's wonderful. Well, I was brought up, I was middle-class parents, lower middle class, they weren't rich or anything, but, you know, I'm 70 now, so when I was a young man, you had to do national service, you had to go into the armed services. And through some accident or other, I went into the Navy. Now, at that time, I was 22. I was an accountant, a qualified chartered accountant. And it meant that I could have got a commission in the Navy, but that would have meant I'd have been either on an aircraft carrier or I'd been on shore. And I didn't want to be an accountant anyway. I did it for my parents, you know, who had no profession and they wanted me to have a profession. So I said, fine, I'll become an accountant and then you can have the certificate and then I do what I want to do. Anyway, so I was in the Navy and I chose to go on the lower deck. So it was just an education for me because it was a minesweeper that I was on for 2 years. And it was a fishery protection minesweeper. So I went all around all the fishing ports in England, Iceland, you know, the Arctic, all of those places. But the fishing ports in England was such a revelation to me. They were Hogarthian. The poverty that I saw was just too shocking. And it affected me. I just became, and of course then on the ship itself you had this unbelievable class barrier between the wardroom, which is the officers, and the men, was so extraordinary, so extreme, that it made me pretty extreme. So whilst, you know, so I've always been fairly radical in terms of my politics since. But prior to that, you know, my parents were both very conservative, and I was conservative until I did my national service. But the whole thing was such a shock to my system. It was the best thing that ever happened to me, actually. So yes, I am. But I'm not a member of any political party as such. It concerns me what's happening very much, and I'm sad that the world is moving so rapidly to the right all the time. It makes me sad, and unnecessary. It's unnecessary as well. Anyway, but that's another matter. Started my film career was pretty meteoric. In other words, I wrote 2 very successful television films, which I wrote, directed, and produced. And as a result of that, I was off for this feature film with Michael Caine, which is in England called Get Carter. And that was very successful. And then I did a film called Pulp, again with Michael Caine, Mickey Rooney, Elizabeth Scott, Lionel Stand, a whole range of different people, which was a black comedy. You asked me earlier about fascism. Well, this was about fascism, but it was a comedy, which again was critically very successful, not very successful at the box office. And then I went to America and I did The Terminal Man with George Segal and Jill Clayburgh and Joan Hackett, which was a Michael Crichton novel which I adapted, wrote and produced for Warner Brothers. So I had a kind of very quick and fairly meteoric rise in 3 different films and 3 critically successful and interesting films. And then I had another project which I wanted to do, which was called Mid-Atlantic. And I was 4 or 5 years trying to get this, with Malcolm McDowell was going to be in it, and I just couldn't get it together. So I went 4 years or 5 years probably without making a film. And I had been asked to make Omen 1 before, and I didn't like it, the script at all. But Omen 2 interested me politically, and if you ever look at Omen 2, you'll see that it actually was about a large American corporation which actually corners the world's food market. This is 1976, something like that, or 76, 77. And also it's about genetically modified food. It was really very ahead of its time. But and it amused me politically, so I'd agreed to do Omen 2. But I fell out with the producer, and I left the film after 3 weeks shooting. It was not a happy experience. So really, my career was not in good shape. I had a very quick and, as I said, start, and and the films were all very different. And I'd always intended really doing thrillers. Anyway, out of the blue, I was asked to do Flash Gordon, and I must say I was very reluctant because I really didn't think it was my meat at all. And I did agree to do it. And I'm glad. I really enjoyed. I learnt a lot, and I had a great time doing it. In fact, Dino and I started off. It was a bit bumpy to begin with, but once we got going, it was terrific. I learnt how to. One, I liked him, and I learned how to work with him. And what I would do is really simple. I would say, at the end of the day, Dino, I've got this idea. And he'd say, and I'd tell him the idea. And then Dino'd say, hey, Mike, I think about it, right? So then he'd come in the following morning and say, Mike, I have a fantastic idea. And he'd tell me my idea back. And I'd say, fantastic. Now, once I'd learned how to do that, it was very easy. We got on famously. We had absolutely no friction at all. And it was agreed after the initial row, which we had, I said, if you've got anything to say to me, you will say it off the set. If you want to discuss anything with me. And that was always adhered to. He broke the rule once, and I shouted at him so loudly I didn't hear him for 3 days. But that was the arrangement, and it was wonderful. I had a great time with Dino. He looked after me. He was honourable in every respect with me. When I was introduced to Danilo, but I was so reluctant about the whole thing. I was flown to New York, and I just met this wonderful little Italian production designer with these enormous drawings. Dino's office was in just above Central Park, and when they opened these drawings, they were like 6 or 8 feet high, and they would block out the light. And that was my introduction to Danilo, and he's sort of wearing a cap, like a sort of slightly at an angle, and he'd have a scarf around here. And he was a delightful man, but I didn't realize how important it was going to be, because I was just naive. I was just wandering into something reluctantly and not really knowing quite how I was going to make it happen. I mean, I was dealing with certain madness, and one of the drawings that Danilo had done was of Arboria, which is where Prince Baron lives. And there's this big wood with this motorway going through it, And I say, what's the motorway for? And hey, Mike, we build motorway, So he was dealing with McAlpine, who was a big construction company. And you say, I mean, he was as naive as I was, truthfully. So that, I would say, but there's nothing in the script about a motorway in Arboria. Hey, right, how many films you make? I say 10, say. Yeah, I make 400. So he was always, he was a delightful person to work with, but there was all sorts of, they had a whole design team coming in from Fiat to design a space car, which defied the film. I said, well, where's the space car going to go? All these things were going on. We really didn't know what we were doing for ages at the beginning. So you would go off on all these sort of stints. He saw an illustrated book where one of the skies took his fancy. So the painter of this Prince somebody or other is flown in from Switzerland, and they give him a room at the back of the studio. And he disappears for like 2 weeks, right? And we get occasion. The Prince would like, Baron, I guess, Baron. The Baron would like a portable radio. The Baron would like a cup of tea, whatever. We never saw him. He's white smock. He did the whole thing properly. And then they say the Baron is ready with the painting. So this is for our skies, right? So we all march down to the studio, Dino leading the way like Mussolini. So we go in, open the doors. There's the easel with a cloth over it, and the Baron pulls the cloth away, and there's this painting, right? It's a very nice painting. So, how fantastic, says Dino. So, everyone, oh, fantastic, fantastic painting of the sky. So I say, what do we do with the painting? Hey, we film it. So I say, fine, I'll go and film it. So I pan it, and then we got a picture pan across the picture, pan up the picture. That was it. The guy goes back to Switzerland, the picture's, somebody nicks it, and Dino's after to try and find where the picture is, but the picture was never going to solve the problem of our skies. They have to be animated, the skies. You can't have just a picture. So it was all like that. But it was I mean, it was so funny and, as well as everything else. I never thought we'd ever finish the film, ever. So that's the truth of the matter. So, but it was a delightful relationship. I loved it. But it was so amusing all the time. Danilo introduced me to a whole other aspect of filmmaking, which is really very theatrical. Everything I'd done up until then had been sort of realistic in a way. I mean, melodrama and, you know, but basically pretty gritty sort of stuff. Pulp, well, that's with Get Card. Pulp, I started sort of experimenting with a sort of black comedy and shot it in a completely different way to Carter. It was much... it was much wider. I was interested in different things altogether. And I had, for example, I had Gite Magrini, the costume designer from the Conformist, Il Conformista, did the costume. So I was already beginning to sort of feel my way. And so when Danilo and I were working together, I talked a lot to him about the sets that he did for Fellini, and in particular Casanova, I loved that film. It was wonderful. So he told me about, I don't know whether you remember, when Casanova's rowing the nun across to the island, and they just had black plastic with a wind machine underneath it. And it was I thought it was really inventive the way they used simple ideas. So years later, then I was asked to do a Tom Stoppard script called Square in the Circle, which was about Poland and about Solidarność and the political situation. There were an enormous number of scenes in the film. We had only 4 weeks to shoot it, and it was all studio bound. And I was about the 8th director to ask to make it, and no one had really cracked how to do it, because Stoppard hadn't really written a film script. He'd written a very witty, erudite piece, but it wasn't a film script. So I contacted an old Polish friend of mine called Wojtek Romain, who is a brilliant designer, and I'd known him as a friend for years, but never worked together. So I rang him up, and Wojtek was the obvious choice. So he and I sat down, and on a weekend we worked out how to do the piece. So again, it's like Danilo. It was a theatrical piece. We built this big steel structure, which you could then, with gantries, so you could turn it into an airport. You could put a cyc round. You could put a big bust of Lenin, and that would be the communist headquarters. You could, you put corrugated iron, and you would be going to Lech Wałęsa's flat, and so on and so on. And then you could also turn it into the steelworks of Gdansk. So it was like a jigsaw puzzle set, which you made realistic or unreal, whichever way you wanted. But there were various scenes which were meant to be on the beaches at the Black Sea. So the studio people were nervous about me doing the studio, because everyone had using a studio, because they'd all thought about using locations, which was unreasonable, because it was largely to do with words. And if you were shooting on location, these wonderful speeches that Stoppard had written, you'd never hear. So I remembered what Danilo had said about the plastic and the wind machine. And I suddenly thought, well, all you do is you just get a sheet of clear plastic and run it up to a white cyc, and you get a ton of pebbles, so that's the beach. You just put all the pebbles down there. And then you get a wind machine under the white plastic, and you hit it with light. You know, when you look at the sea on a sunny day, it's sort of the light bounces off it. And of course, it was a wonderful beach, and it was a theatrical beach. I didn't say it was a real beach, but when you laid the sound effects on, seagulls and the rest of it, it was absolutely for real. So it was wonderful being able to use that kind of inventiveness that Danilo had used with Fellini. Working with Fellini was a totally different, that was an accident. It wasn't anything to do with knowing Danilo or working with him. What had happened was that I had serious surgery. I was quite ill at the beginning of the 80s. And so I'd had surgery. And then through Stanley Kubrick, Fellini rang Stanley Kubrick up and said, Stanley, how do my film's in English? And no, good, please, Stanley, what do I do? So Stanley, being Stanley, says, I get a director in each country. He get Truffaut or somebody, a great director here to look after the French translation. In Spain, he'll get Almodovar to do it, and they would like to do it for him. So he suggested they got me to do it, which is an honor. And of course, as I'd had this surgery, I was very weak. It was major surgery. So with this as a job, you could sit down, with the actors, and you're back in England. So I went to Rome, and we ran the film, and we talked, and we talked about the casting, and then I studied. I saw his film. I don't know, about 100 times, I should think, in the 2 months or whatever it was. But it was a job I could do sitting down, as well as being able to look at this film and analyze it, which was really, I just loved it. It was just wonderful. The simplicity of it was just daunting, actually. It was a big success, and certainly in my own country. Flash made a lot of money. It was one of the big grossers of the 80s. In America, it was sad, actually, because what had happened was that Sam Jones, who played Flash, it was his first big role ever. And he had a management team, an agent or a manager, who fell into conflict with Dino. And Sam never came back after we'd finished principal photography. We broke for Christmas. And then I was doing more stuff after Christmas, what I needed Sam for, and he never came back to the UK. He never came back to Britain. So there was there was a chasm between Dino and Sam Jones. So in America, it meant that Sam, who would have been wonderful on the talk shows and things like that, never went out on the talk shows. They even tried to move the emphasis onto Ming. The first posters that they tried over there was Ming the Merciless, which was damn silly if you're making a film called Flash Gordon and you've got Max von Sydow as Ming the Merciless, because they were trying to do it without using Sam, without helping him in any way. So whilst it got really good reviews there, and it did good business, but it was nothing like the business it should have done. The previews were absolutely gigantic, so they screwed up in America, certainly. But in the UK, Italy, very interesting, the South American, places where they like vivid colours. They really did like South America, Spain, Italy. I don't know about France, I do. But anyway, it seemed to attract the kind of Latinos, certainly, in terms of the vivaciousness of the piece. So, it was a successful film. I'm sure they made their money back, although I don't know how much they spent in the first place. Not at all. I just think Flash, they're not strip cartoon films. They're something different altogether. I mean, Flash, we went a completely different route, in terms of the colours, in terms of all the things that I've talked about. And this balance between comedy and laughing with as opposed to at. But it's a completely different world, I think, altogether. Flash Gordon from... it's very interesting that it's the other way around, really, that Lucas wanted to make Flash Gordon, and because he couldn't make Flash Gordon, he made Star Wars, which, oddly enough, is totally different to Flash Gordon anyway. As I said, I wasn't brought up on comic strips anyway, for a start, and I wasn't brought up at Saturday morning cinema. And fantasy films, they don't really interest. I don't know why. They don't really. So I did Flash Gordon just purely because I was asked to make it, and I was curious to see if I could make it. And I certainly loved making it, and I loved the film. Star Wars doesn't mean much to me. None of those other films mean much to me. It's only because I made this one. We probably wouldn't have even seen Flash Gordon if I hadn't made it.
What about 2001?
2001, well, that's something else altogether, isn't it? I mean, that's a great film. I mean, I thought it was wonderful when it came out. But I don't think that's a fantasy film. Do you?
Metaphysical.
Metaphysical, certainly. Well, if it's a metaphysical film, I'm very interested then, always. It's odd if you're a British filmmaker, because there's really no film culture it's not like France or even America, because there is no industry. And whilst there's a lot of people who like films, there really isn't a film culture any longer. There was in the 50s and before the war, but it's vanished, you know. So I'd always been trying to get a base on which to work, you know, in the UK. And I was asked to make this film called Morons from Outer Space. It was not called that originally, and it was called Illegal Aliens. And I really liked the principle behind this film. It was written by two very intelligent British comedians called Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones, and they do a lot of television work. It was their first feature film. I think their first feature film. And the principle, the premise of the piece was that if an alien creature came from outer space, that it might not be, as it's always portrayed in the cinema, as a super intelligent, super humane, super kind, super being. It might, if you took the trajectory of our own civilization, it might be going in reverse. In other words, they could be really stupid. So I did like that, as I don't have, I'm not a great fan of the century that I'm living in. So the dumbing down process has reached a sort of a conclusion somewhere else out there. So this spaceship comes in, and these three people are really stupid. And the process by which everyone tries to find out, because they assume that they're going to be super intelligent, as they suddenly realize they really are stupid. I find amusing. And in addition to which they became celebrities, which is perfect for our times as well, because most celebrities are stupid. So it seemed to me the perfect vehicle. I think the film is very flawed, personally, but there's great things in it, I think. But I wish that Mel and Griff didn't take it seriously enough, in my opinion. I think if they'd taken it really seriously, then it could have been a really terrific film, I think. And there are all sorts. It's a miracle what we did for the money that we had. It wasn't very expensive, but in terms of special effects and all the rest of it, it was certainly pretty good, I thought, actually. I started in documentaries, and I sort of the whole of the '60s for me was a wonderful period, because I did a TV World in Action, which was a current affairs program in Britain, which took me to Vietnam. It was my introduction to America, which up until then, my vision of America had been through sort of Doris Day films, and, you know, it looked like a really lovely country. Everyone was so nice, and their front doors were open, and they sang musicals, and they, you know, and with few exceptions, it was a view of America which I'd had from the cinema, which was, I found, it was totally deceptive, because my introduction to it was a profile of Barry Goldwater Jr., who was the Republican candidate who wanted to nuke Vietnam. So that was my introduction. I shot him in Dallas a year after Kennedy was assassinated. The second thing I then went to was I went to Vietnam and discovered the total naivety of the people there. And only an idiot would have known that they could, ever dreamt that they could possibly win that war. They couldn't even look at the experience that the French had had with that. And then the third thing that I had to deal with in America was the American unions, and I dealt with the UAW, the United Automobile Workers Union, and I met Walter and Victor Reuther. Walter Reuther had one arm which had been blown off by Henry Ford's G-men, and Victor Reuther, his brother, had been shot in his own sitting room and lost one eye by Henry Ford's G-men. So suddenly my perception of America was completely different to the one that I'd had when I started that program. Then after I finished Worlds in Action, I did an arts program. And I did profiles on all sorts of filmmakers and painters and various people like that, including Jean-Luc Godard, Jacques Tati, Rob Grillet. I did a lot of filming in Paris in those days. So all of those things tended to, you know, be the basis for my dramas. Usually they were all based on sort of certain elements, I mean, of fact. It was with Get Carter, for example, the film with Michael Caine. It was a novel, and a fictional novel, and I wrote the script based on the novel, but then when I just chose to shoot it in the north of England in Newcastle, I then started researching an actual murder that had happened there, and it gave me the basis on which to ground the work of fiction into something that had really happened. So I used a lot of locations and a whole range of extras and various details, really, which and then Pulp, you know, was based on my observation that in Italy, the fascist party had made a comeback in the local elections, a really big swing. And I'd always, you know, I just assumed as a kid when I'd witnessed, you know, what had happened in the concentration camps, that nobody could possibly want to go back to fascism. I just couldn't believe this. So I wrote a comedy, which is called Pulp in the end, which was again based on, I went to Mussolini's tomb and I sort of investigated. There was a very famous scandal in the 60s called the Montesi scandal, when this girl was found dead on the beach, and then they found that everyone got involved in it. The Pope got involved, all the members of the government. And this case went on for 10 years, and they had all sorts of insane people. They had fortune tellers, trying to find who did the murder and so on. So I wrote a comedy based on all of those things. Originally it was called Memoirs of a Ghostwriter, in which Michael Caine plays this terrible hack writer. So and then The Terminal Man, was a Michael Crichton thing, which was particularly relevant now because it's about implanting, electrodes into the brain and then activating them to alleviate violent attacks. So again, that was very research based. I mean, Crichton had done most of the research for me in the book, but then I read a lot of Koestler, Ghost in the Machine and various other books like that. Black Rainbow, metaphysical as it is, actually came out of, again, the grassroots of American, particularly in America, society. And I'd been there a lot over the previous decade, and I did notice whenever I went to local towns that there were a lot of workers who were often beaten up and sometimes even murdered for spilling the beans to safety and health authorities. So I really was interested in doing, well, in America, the union movement is rock bottom, and there's no union movement, there's no protection for workers at all. And I was interested in doing a thriller based around that. But then I added another element altogether, which is the kind of metaphysical element of fundamentalist religion and a whole range of how it's attracted to all of that. So I turned it into something else, but it is a political film. There's no two ways about that. So I like to hang on to the kind of reality. My films are totally unreal, but it's my own peculiar. I'm sure everybody works the same way. But I'd certainly like to research the stuff, but it does come all the way back from my documentary days. Out of the blue, I was offered a script called Croupier, which is written by somebody I knew as a friend, called Paul Marsberg, who wrote The Man Who Fell to Earth. He worked with Nick Roeg a lot. He wrote Eureka, Man Who Fell to Earth. And then he wrote Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Anyway, they came to me. I don't quite know why. Anyway, and I loved Paul's script. I just thought it was terrific. And I cast Clive Owen. And it had a slightly checkered history so far as that the film was, again, I've suffered terribly from distribution. It was going to be dumped in the UK, and nobody was particularly interested in this film. And a friend of mine who loved it managed to get a distributor in America, and the film became a kind of cause célèbre in Hollywood, in LA, and in America. We went to about 150 screens, and the reviews were like out of this world. I mean, I could have written them myself. So the whole film, out of nothing, suddenly became this big hit. It was my final irony in my career, I tell you. I was sitting back in England, my country place, digging the vegetables and things like that. Meanwhile, in America, this film was gathering all these reviews, and it was making a lot of money at the box office. So to such a degree that the company I'd made the film for in the UK was so ashamed of themselves because they were having dealings with Hollywood, and they said, what a great film, that they had to redistribute it. And of course, it then did very well in the UK. So suddenly I was fashionable again. I mean, see what a silly joke is. The whole business is a foolish nonsense, because I hadn't changed. I had made a film. I hadn't changed as a filmmaker. I was still the same filmmaker. Anyway, now I've got a hit, so everything changes, you see. So I'd had this script for I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, and I gave it to Clive Owen, who's the star of Croupier, and he liked it. So then we were able to prior to that, I couldn't get arrested. In Auckland, with this script, no one would touch it. It's a very tough script. But now we suddenly got the money out of the blue from one single American, which is first time ever in my life. So I've just finished shooting it with Clive Owen, Charlotte Rampling, Malcolm McDowell, and Jonathan Rhys-Meyers. And my the line producer was my goddaughter. It's not that I believe in God. I don't know how the hell I cook up that one. And Mike Kaplan's the producer. He's the guy who managed to get Croupier's release. And I used my son's restaurant as one of the locations. So I've been amongst friends. I tell you, it's been lovely. You know, I draw and paint, and that's dead easy because no one comes between you and the piece of paper. But you know, when you've got to get millions of dollars to make a film, people get a bit edgy, don't they? They get a bit scared. That's when money intrudes, and they make all the wrong decisions. You wonder why they employed you in the first place when they interfere. I don't understand that. That's never made any sense to me. If they employ you to direct film, then they should go with your vision. And to interfere in that vision, why waste the money to employ you in the first place? They buy your instincts, and then they try and take your instincts away. Stupid. So I'm only going to make films with friends now. It's the only way to do it. You can't. These other butchers out there, forget them. They're ruthless, and it's a nightmare. Why bother?
You were an amazing fighter.
Well, fighter.
Yes.
A survivor.